Okay.
Thank you. So yes, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Kate Quinn, and I'm lecturer in Caribbean history at the Institute of the Americas. Apologies for the late start due to technical issues, and especially apologies to Nicolás, because I know it's not pleasant to be kind of in the middle of a technical maelstrom just before your talk is about to start. But I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Nicolás Prados, who is a colleague at the Institute. He's lecturer in Latin American and Caribbean history at UCL Institute of the Americas. His research focuses on the Latin American Cold War and the meanings of democracy at the intersection of revolution and repression. He has notable publications in this area, including his first monograph, Cuba and the Caribbean Cold War, published in 2020, which re-examines the Cuban Revolution in the 1950s as part of a wider regional struggle between democracy and dictatorship. And it's this regional perspective that he's bringing to us today in his talk called Our Liberty is Your Liberty, Democracy and Revolution in the Foreign Policy of Carlos Prío. So over to you, Nicolás.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you also to Steve and Gad for the invitation to allow me to share my research in this seminar. I'm going to try to share my screen. Hopefully, after everything we've gone through, this will be the easiest part. Let me know.
Yeah, that's fine. Good. We can see the.
Let's see if everything good so far.
Yeah, we've got it on view now.
Okay, great. Well, as I said, thank you very much for the invitation, and I will try to keep the presentation relatively brief because I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions and sort of the discussion. I guess just some quick context on what I'm presenting. This is a chapter for an upcoming edited volume on the Cuban Second Republic, which is roughly the period between 1940 and the mid-1950s. I mean, I will get a bit more into that later, which is edited by Ariel Lamb and Melina Papademos at the University of Connecticut. So without further ado, at an event in Venezuela, the Cuban president-elect declared, "The day in which all Americans are free is not far. The time of the exiled and the persecuted is coming." The audience erupted into cheers, chanting, "Down with the tyrants," and yelling, "Viva Cuba" and "Viva Venezuela." Cuban president-elect Carlos Prío was in the midst of a regional tour of his party's allies, which had taken him from Mexico to Guatemala, Venezuela, and Costa Rica. Prío's rhetoric is quite surprising for a diplomatic tour, but the crowd's reaction suggests that he wasn't entirely out of line. In fact, many of his speeches during this tour were well received by audiences from trade unions to university students and by newspapers from Guadalajara to Caracas. These visits were not merely acts of protocol, but rather part of a political offensive to position the future Cuban government within the political divide that contemporaries identified in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, the struggle between democracy and dictatorship. This presentation will examine two aspects of Prío's foreign policy, which underpinned his administration and were established weeks after winning the presidential election. One will be the interplay between democracy and revolution as defined by contemporaries, and the other is the crucial role of exiles and exile in shaping the administration's policy. So just a quick overview of where this stands in Cuban historiography. Prío's tenure is located in a slightly awkward place within Cuban mid-century history, in a historiography that has been often defined by the counterpoint between Castro and Batista. Prío occupies a space in a brief democratic interlude, sometimes known as the Second Republic, which is the period between the 1940 Constitution and 1952, when Fulgencio Batista overthrew Prío and suspended the Constitution. This period was ruled by three democratically elected presidents, first Batista, then Grau, and then Prío, and the latter two belonged to the Partido Revolucionario Cubano Auténtico, known as the Auténticos, which were kind of the hegemonic party of the Second Republic. This period, however, has been defined by Cuban historian Luis Pérez Jr. as a lagoon of serious proportions in Cuban historiography. Indeed, to the best of my knowledge, for example, we don't have a biography of Carlos Prío. We have plenty on Castro and Batista, one on Grau, as much as I could find, but nothing on Prío, for example. Some historians have examined the period, the mid-1940s, as a democratic spring in Latin America, with the rise of promising but short-lived democratic experiments. Less attention, however, has been paid to how democracy itself was understood and defined by contemporaries. Instead, many authors have adopted present-day definitions of democracy and projected them into the past. And by this metric, some scholars have dismissed the Auténtico rule as a failure, disregarded due to corruption, violence, and mismanagement. I think. Democracy, as a concept, has also failed to draw the attention of scholars of the Cold War in Latin America, who have felt more comfortable dealing with the capitalist-socialist dichotomy. At the time, the late 1940s, 1950s, US officials were equally uncomfortable with all this rhetoric coming from their Latin American counterparts, who spoke and wrote of a clash between dictatorship and democracy. US officials were reticent to frame any conflict south of the Rio Bravo in those terms, preferring to speak of merely contests between the ins and the outs, or as one particularly cynical CIA officer put it, a confrontation between rival, quote, banana alignments, end quote. So perhaps unsurprisingly, English-speaking Cold War scholarship, which for decades relied overwhelmingly on US sources, overlooked this confrontation. However, as the Cold War in Latin America becomes the Latin American Cold War, so that is, as historians pay closer attention to how Latin Americans themselves understood and defined the conflict of their time, the ideological cleavage underpinning this period is called into question. US officials might have understood the Cold War as a contest between capitalism and socialism, but was this the defining divide south of their border? This presentation pushes further in this direction, exploring how transnational political rivalries took shape on the ground, and in what ways they challenge our hitherto superpower-centric view of the Cold War. So the plan for today's presentation is first to locate Carlos Prío in the context of Cuban and regional politics by explaining his career from being a student revolutionary in the early 30s to becoming president-elect in 1948, followed by an examination of his tour in the summer of 1948 of allies in the Caribbean region in order to present his image regionally as a champion of democracy in a way that he would define it. And finally, I will briefly examine to what extent did rhetoric translate into reality once he actually became president. So just very briefly on Carlos Prío in his political context, Prío had been a student leader in the 1920s and early 1930s in the rebellion against dictator Gerardo Machado. Due to his opposition, he was sent to prison repeatedly, and after a brief stint in power when student revolutionaries in 1933 were at the helm of a short-lived government, Batista overthrew the revolutionary government, and once again, Prío was forced into exile, this time in Mexico, where he engaged in gun running and other insurrectionary activities. And I included this illustration in an article from the Cuban magazine Bohemia from 1938, which is It's published in the late 1930s as Batista's dictatorship is opening up towards political opposition. So opposition political parties are becoming legalized. And it's a quick article on a little adventure that Prío and some colleagues experienced while they were living in Mexico, when the plane they were using to smuggle weapons between Mexico and Cuba crashed in the Yucatan Peninsula. And they had to survive for, I think it's around 10 days crossing the Yucatan Peninsula. And Bohemia has a very kind of sensational story titled, I think it's Stranded in the Green Hell. And it has this kind of very dramatic, romantic depiction of Prío and his colleagues as young revolutionaries engaged in direct action and smuggling. And this is very much the image that Prío would attempt to build during his political career. And as you can see from the timeline, as the Cuban political system opens up in the late 1930s and eventually electoral democracy enters the fray, Prío's career transitions from this kind of romantic student hero to becoming first prime minister under Grau's presidency in 1946, later labor minister, and then finally presidential candidate in 1948. So during this period, during Prío's early political career, he became very close to Enriquez, known as Cotu Panamá, or Cotu for short, who was a fellow Auténtico Party member and the drafter of the party's founding manifesto. And Cotu and Prío were not just friends, but eventually became family when Cotu married Prío's sister. Cotu was Dominican by birth and committed to the liberation of the Dominican Republic, which since 1930 was dominated by the dictatorship of Rafael Trujillo. So to this aim, to liberate the Dominican Republic, Cotu combined his militancy in the Auténtico Party with the creation of a sister party for the Dominican Republic. So if he had been the founder of the Partido Revolucionario Cubano, in the late 1930s, he decided to create the Partido Revolucionario Dominicano. And to help him in this task, he recruited a young novelist exiled in Puerto Rico at the time called Juan Bosch, who moved to Havana in the late 1930s and in turn became acquainted with Prío and the political milieu of the late 1930s. In fact, Bosch would go on to become Prío's aide in the 1940s when the latter was a cabinet minister. So by the 1940s, Prío's involvement with exile was twofold. It was both part of his political upbringing, he lived through it when he was in Mexico, but also through Cotu and Bosch, it was part of his personal and political environment. So in 1948, as candidate of the Auténtico Party, the elections pit him against a man called Núñez Portuondo from the Liberal Party, which had been the political party of Gerardo Machado, the dictator of the late 1920s, against whom Prío had earned his revolutionary credentials. Therefore, for the Auténtico Party, the election strategy was straightforward. They would frame it as a contest between the Cuban Revolution, understood as the Cuban period that had begun with the 1940 Constitution and that was based on the student movement of the 1930s, against the reactionaries of the 1920s. In this context, Prío successfully leveraged his credentials as one of the leading revolutionaries of the 1930 generation to win the presidential contest. Shortly after winning the election, he proudly declared, quote, "Cuba has elected me because I'm a revolutionary." However, Prío didn't frame his revolutionary credentials exclusively in national terms. He defined himself in electoral propaganda in the run-up to the election as a friend of the Dominican and Spanish anti-dictatorial movements. And his election was eagerly anticipated by Dominican exiles who viewed him as a natural ally due to his links to the PRD, the Partido Revolucionario Dominicano. So shortly after winning the presidential election, Prío turned to the question of foreign policy. In fact, days after the election, his Dominican aide, Juan Bosch, was dispatched to Central America to evaluate the political situation. Bosch wrote a lengthy report where he described the region at a tipping point, in a struggle between nascent democracies and archaic dictatorships. Cuba's position in this conflict could be decisive, according to Bosch. He sent a number of thinly veiled hints to Prío and how he should focus his foreign policy. The Dominican praised, for example, the Guatemalan president Juan José Arévalo at length, highlighting that Arévalo's internationalism was precisely what made him a great statesman, and warned Prío that, quote, no ruler has become a great man by limiting himself to the administration of his own territory, just like no man that only fights for his family gains the admiration of his neighbors. So Bosch's policy recommendation to Prío was to give a show of support to democracies in the region with an official tour as president-elect, a tour in which he was encouraged to adopt, quote, energetic and continental language to show on which side his administration would be on. It's also important to consider Juan Bosch's personal position within the elaboration of this tour. So as an exiled leader of the PRD, he had traveled extensively around the Caribbean and was deeply embedded in a transnational anti-dictatorial network. So, for example, he managed to have an audience with the Guatemalan president, Juan José Arévalo, through the mediation of Dominican exiles that had lived with Arévalo in Argentina, where the latter had spent several years in self-imposed exile. Similarly, Bosch was close to Venezuelan President Rómulo Betancourt, from when the latter had been an exile in the Dominican Republic during his student days in the late 1920s. Later, when Betancourt and his party, which was called Acción Democrática, came to power in 1945, Betancourt repaid the favor to Bosch by inviting him to Venezuela and hosting him on several occasions. So as we can already see, exile is very much at the center of these political connections in the mid-1940s. Prío took Bosch's advice on board and almost to the letter. In the summer of 1948, he visited Mexico, Guatemala, Venezuela, and Costa Rica. And during his speeches in this tour, three main topics perhaps vertebrated his interventions: exile, democracy, and revolution. So exile, unsurprisingly, played a big role in his first visit to Mexico, where he had been an exile in the early 1930s. Exile altered the boundaries of politics. Prío described Mexico as a, quote, fraternal old home, and one of his hosts remarked that Cubans and Mexicans could not feel foreign in each other's countries. Questioning national borders allowed these politicians to transcend the framework of the nation-state and instead speak of American issues. Prío argued, for example, that Americans had a desire to make this continent the home of justice and democracy, and Cuba was willing to undertake all sacrifices to defend America's democracy. In this way, exile opened the door to internationalism and a sense of interdependence. The survival of democracy in one country was seen as dependent on its advancement elsewhere. While in Guatemala, for example, Prío declared, "Part of our liberty is your liberty, and any democratic president must preach that form of government outside his borders if he does not wish to expose himself to having to defend it within them." In fact, he concluded this intervention by saying, "Cuba has elected me because I'm a revolutionary, but the revolution is not Cuban. The revolution has no nationality." So I guess the obvious follow-up question is, well, what exactly did he mean by revolution? His views on the topic were mainly informed by his background in law, contemporary views of Latin American history, and his experience in the Cuban student movement. So in a way, he understood revolution as a legal break with the past. So against the individualistic, quote-unquote, liberal bourgeois 19th century law, Prío defended a new legality that would emphasize collective rights over individual rights. For example, he questioned the divide between private and public law and defended the notion of property as possessing a social function. He was also a supporter of state intervention in the economy, in property relations, and in labor management, or in labor relations. During his reception in Guatemala, his counterpart Arevalo described the opposition of democracy versus dictatorship as the struggle of the 20th century against the 19th century. So these ideas on revolution and democracy were very much entangled with concepts of modernity, whereas dictatorship was seen as an archaic form of government of the past, sometimes connected to monarchy, for example. Several of these ideas, perhaps I would highlight the idea of property having a social function, were in line with a broader revision of liberalism, which was taking place in Latin America at the time, particularly since the Mexican Revolution of the 1910s. However, this revision of liberalism did not entail a complete rejection. Some of its elements were retained. So, for example, Prío highlighted during the tour the importance of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of organization into plural political parties, and emphasized parliament as the site where popular sovereignty resided. He chose to describe himself as a quote-unquote revolutionary nationalist, which meant a staunch defense of sovereignty against foreign meddling. He criticized US imperialism while in Guatemala and equally attacked communist parties as servants of Soviet imperialism. In his view, industrialization was the path to economic liberation and thus full sovereignty. So very broadly, and within the sort of spaces that he was speaking at during this tour, Prío laid out somewhat of a program premised on political and economic liberation. Political liberation from authoritarianism through increased popular participation in democratic politics and transnational internationalist support to fellow democracies. And on the other hand, economic liberation provided by industrialization and a greater role for the state as guarantor of worker welfare. It's also important to note that during this tour, Prío was having a series of meetings behind the scenes with representatives of exiled factions who were lobbying for his support, mainly organizations from Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, and some from Honduras. His arrival to a lot of these destinations was always preceded by Juan Bosch's, who acted as a broker between the Cuban and other exiles, reinforcing his own position in the process. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Dominican Republic, the Dominican government protested vigorously at a lot of Prío's rhetoric during the tour and met with US State Department officials to express their disagreement. They mentioned that Bosch was influencing Cuba's foreign policy and he was a declared enemy of the Dominican regime. Initially, US officials dismissed Dominican concerns, but grew worried after Prío's anti-imperialist rhetoric in Guatemala, where he gave a speech at the San Carlos University, which, according to sort of US diplomatic sources, was very embarrassing for diplomatic staff who was present, but it elicited very strong kind of passionate reactions from the student audience and was largely well received by students. The US government was quite skeptic of Prío. In the reports of Foreign Service officials who were following this tour, his revolutionary nationalism was described as quote-unquote violent supranationalism. What Prío or Bosch thought that was continental rhetoric, US officials found as being an insular outlook because of its limitations on Latin American politics. It's interesting to note this because it reveals the gulf in understanding between Prío and his cohort and US officials. What to the former was continental, to the latter sounded parochial. Perhaps part of the reason why the US government was skeptic of Prío is simply that Núñez Portuondo had been their favorite candidate in the 1948 election. Prío also drew criticism from Caribbean communist parties, and perhaps particularly by the Cuban Communist Party, who attacked him, who described him as, quote, the new Creole lackey of imperialism. The Cuban Communist Party was particularly offended by Prío's attacks on communist parties in the region, and this was part of this was the relationship between Prío and the Cuban Communist Party was very much part of a kind of long-running dispute, which began as early as the early 1940s, when the Communist Party was in power with Batista and the Auténticos were in the opposition. And then sort of the revenge when Prío became Labour Prime Minister and he cracked down on communist control of the trade union, employing violence and pistolerismo. So if we look at these reactions to Prío's rhetoric throughout this tour, we see a quite unlikely Cold War coalition. The tour was criticized or seen as less than ideal, I guess, depending on how diplomatic the sources were, by military dictators, the US government, and communist parties. So to what extent did any of this rhetoric, when it came to foreign relations, translate into reality? Prío had several opportunities during his tenure to demonstrate whether his commitment to American democracy abroad was genuine or not. He did so by sending military support to Costa Rica and Guatemala when both came under attack from guerrillas sponsored by dictatorships in December 1948 and in the summer of 1949. He also supported a guerrilla incursion into the Dominican Republic in the summer of 1949, co-organized with the PRD and with the support of the Guatemalan government. However, he didn't limit his action to military support, but he also lent diplomatic support to his allies. When the Venezuelan government of Rómulo Betancourt and Acción Democrática was overthrown in 1948, Prío attempted to intercede in their favor with US President Truman, who, according to one source, was uninterested and partly believed that the Acción Democrática government was responsible for their own overthrow. In 1950, for example, Prío sponsored a Continental Congress for Democracy and Freedom, organized by Acción Democrática, the Venezuelan political party now in exile, and the PRD, the Dominican party, which was held in Havana and gathered a number of American personalities, both from the North and the South. And this picture you see here from the event shows Rómulo Betancourt on the left, speaking with Salvador Allende on the right, who was leading the Chilean delegation to the conference. And finally, towards the end of his tenure, Prío attempted to mediate between the Guatemalan government, which was under pressure from the United Fruit Company and US Foreign Service, and the Truman government. So he wrote a series of letters to Truman with a number of policy recommendations to mediate in the disputes. However, all of his letters were dismissed to the point where Prío started suspecting that they were not reaching Truman, and in fact, they were just being thrown away by State Department officers. So on the 10th of March, 1952, Prío's presidency came to an end when he was overthrown by Batista in a coup d'etat. Unsurprisingly, Batista's dictatorship was recognized first by the Dominican, Venezuelan, and Nicaraguan dictatorships within hours of the news becoming public. Exiles living in Havana had to flee, and those who stayed, like Bosch, were harassed by the Cuban secret police following requests from Trujillo. However, Prío's contacts during his time in power would play a key role during the insurrection against Batista between 1952 and 1958, when Prío was able to mobilize a vast network of allies and agents across the region. And this is partly the subject of my first book, Cuba in the Caribbean Cold War, where I looked at how Fidel Castro's Movimiento 26 de Julio managed to tap into this network through an uneasy collaboration with Prío's own revolutionary organization, which is called the Organización Auténtica. So what does this tell us about Cuban history or Cuban and Caribbean history, about Latin American Cold War history, about the history of democracy in Latin America, and about the history of exile? So to take these one by one, we can see there that Prío's ouster was not merely the quote, fall of a rotten fruit, as an unsympathetic contemporary put it, but a blow to democracy in the region. And I don't mean this just because, as someone who had been elected, this represented a setback regionally. but because, as I hope I have shown, it removed a key defender of other democratic regimes in the region and paved the way for future military coups, such as the one in Guatemala in 1954. So it's worth noting, for example, that Castillo Armas, the Guatemalan colonel who led the 1954 overthrow of Arbenz, had previously failed in his first attempt in 1949 because of Prio's support to the Guatemalan government. Just a year after his first failure, Castillo Armas, who at the time was being encouraged by the US government to have another go at overthrowing the Guatemalan government, said that he was unwilling to do so as long as Cuba and Mexico were supporting the Guatemalan government. So we can see in this case how the removal of Prío was of profound consequences, not just for Cuban politics, but in this case for Guatemalan. And through the overthrow of the Guatemalan regime, the reverberations that had on Latin American politics for decades to follow. This case study also casts a certain amount of doubt on the validity of socialism versus capitalism as the guiding axis of a Cold War confrontation. In fact, judging from some of the statements I presented in this PowerPoint, the dichotomy reads as excessively US-centric from the Caribbean. Instead, we find a different ideological alignment, where pro-democratic elements like the Auténticos, the PRD, or the Venezuelan Acción Democrática were opposed by an unlikely alliance of military dictators, communist parties, and the US government. This also has repercussions for the discussion on the agency of Latin Americans during the Cold War. So we should not see a local South versus a global South, to paraphrase Aldo Marchesi, since Latin American actors had ambitions of continental and sometimes global scope, and they implemented highly interventionist foreign policies to advance their aims. So they were not merely the victims of intervention or superpower machinations, but players in their own right. Through this case study, I guess we can also see how notions of democracy held during this period drew from deep Latin American roots and were not imported from the US or Europe. In other words, US war propaganda did not bring democracy to Latin America because it was already there. This Latin American understanding of democracy emerged in dialogue and in opposition to previous experiences of democracy in the region. As we have seen, it defined itself in opposition to the perceived failures of liberalism and sought to incorporate contemporary ideas on state intervention and socialism. And finally, this case demonstrates that exile did not mark the end of political participation, but often, as in the case of Juan Bosch, the beginning. And I highlight Juan Bosch because he would go on to be president of the Dominican Republic in 1963 and a leading figure in Dominican politics for decades to come. Exiles continued to play a role in politics from abroad, both in their hosting country and in their country of origin. And as we have seen, they were able to craft vast networks of support, which in turn drew different governments together. The alliance between Venezuela, Guatemala, and Cuba owed much to the work of Dominican exiles. Thank you very much.
Bravo. Thank you so much, Nicolás. That was fantastic. I learned so much. I mean, I have to confess, I had no idea the extent to which Juan Bosch had a role in Cuba for a start. So I feel enlightened there. And the paper just clearly speaks to so many issues that we can think about, the role of exile in Latin American and Caribbean politics, the regional solidarities, and the anti-dictatorial alliances, the Cuban tradition of internationalism that's, obviously way precedes the post-1959 variant of that. So there's so much to get our teeth into. If I can do the classic comment and a question combination, it's just, as you're speaking, it really reminded me of a reading that I set for my class when I'm looking at Puerto Rico, and it's a speech by Luis Muñoz Marin, and it's called "In America to Serve the World." And it just struck me as so similar to what you're describing, as in, you know, in the primary sources themselves, the language is very clearly about dictatorship versus democracy. And in this speech, Muñoz Marín is, you know, kind of like framing Puerto Rico as this new third way that isn't going to be either the kind of the extremes of US capitalism, but it's also kind of staving off the threat of you know, the Soviet communism. But he very clearly identifies the problem in Latin America as dictatorships, and presenting Puerto Rico as the new, you know, a new an American, as in America Latina, variant of democracy, and indeed a kind of different economic corollary that goes along with that. That wasn't kind of, you know, North American free market, you know, consumer, you know, all of that. So I mean, that just made me think it's so true what you're saying about how the scholarship that tries to superimpose this socialism versus capitalism binary onto this discourse that's in the sources that, you know, as you say, the sources are telling us something else. So I don't know if you've ever sort of looked across the way to Puerto Rico in a similar period or not. So that was one thing. And then just the question was, how is Prío remembered, or you know, what's his reputation in the historiography within Cuba today? Like, how does he fit into the narrative of, or does he not fit in at all to the narrative of the Cuban Revolution? You mentioned the uneasy relationship with the M26. So I'm wondering, how does that get reflected in post-1959 Cuban scholarship? So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Should I answer now, or how?
Sorry, yes, I think that's
okay.
easiest.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's very interesting you mentioned the case of Muñoz Marín, because there were definitely lots of affinities between him and some of the parties that I'm mentioning. And of course, Puerto Rico is a very interesting issue, not just as a kind of ally in the terms of the Popular Party of Puerto Rico, Muñoz Marín, but the position on Puerto Rico's independence is something that, for example, also complicated relations between Prío and the United States, because the US suspected that the Auténticos were supporting Puerto Rican nationalism. So there are lots of connections with Puerto Rico, and it's always kind of brought up in a lot of public speeches, and the kind of the overall aim of this anti-dictatorial alliance is, in a very interesting letter from Arévalo to Betancourt, so from a Guatemalan to a Venezuelan, which is carried by Bosch, a Dominican, he lays out this very ambitious plan long-term for the Caribbean, different phases, and they all start with overthrowing every single dictatorship, followed by expelling Europeans from the Caribbean, followed by securing the independence of Puerto Rico. That's seen as the kind of culminating achievement of this alliance. And on Prío's space in Cuban historiography, I think he's subsumed a bit into the so-called Second Republic period as a period of chaotic, corrupt politics, usually as a kind of as a populist. It's defined as a sort of as a populist period. It's interesting because initially in 1959, when Castro rose to power, the Auténtico Party, even though it had lost a lot of the legitimacy and popularity it had enjoyed in the 1940s, it was still the largest sort of existing party, no? Given that the Movimiento 26 de Julio at the end of the day was a small organization. And it's very interesting to see how throughout 1959, Castro very skillfully divides the Auténtico Party by praising Prío as a loyal revolutionary, as a real revolutionary, whereas a lot of his colleagues in the Auténtico Party, especially the ones that are more confrontational with his reforms, Castro dismisses as kind of false revolutionaries. So Prío stays on in Cuba for, I think, over a year. And in the kind of first, sort of 1st of May parades, the one in 1959 and in the 1960, Prío is kind of situated right next to Castro as a kind of prominent, kind of living historical figure. But then, of course, Prío has ambitions of his own. He wanted to become president. He wasn't fighting Batista to have someone else become president. So eventually, he leaves Cuba, I think in 1960, and goes to Miami to try to plot. And then in Miami, I think he gets lost in exile politics, and he doesn't feature much again. But sorry, that's a very long kind of answer.
It's so interesting, and yeah, maybe you're the guy to write that missing biography then.
Yeah, I think about it. Yeah, I think about it a lot.
I can see there's a question from Gad, and just to say to everyone else, you can, if you don't want to speak, you can put your questions into the chat, but yes, feel free to line up your questions. So go ahead, Gad.
Yeah, Nicolás, that was extremely interesting. I think you maybe answered my first question, which is why there's no biography of Prío, because you haven't written it. But it is odd in a way, given what you've said, that no one has spent time studying him in that context. So maybe you could expand on that. And I was also curious how he was seen in the rest of the Caribbean. You mentioned, of course, Puerto Rico, but the wider Caribbean, or including Puerto Rico, was there a perception of him?
So he was very much hated by the Dominican government because of his support to Dominican exiles. It's interesting at this time, relationship between Cuban, the Auténtico Party and Prío, and successive Haitian governments, for example. It's interesting to see sometimes some reports from either members of the Auténtico Party or people sort of close to the party, where they describe Haitian politics, because as a country that shares a border with the Dominican Republic, and of course a very fraught history between them, the idea of securing Haiti's alliance against the Dominican Republic is an obvious one. So they're constantly trying to engage with the Haitian government. But it's interesting to see that in a lot of their reports, they don't understand Haitian politics at all. And it's very explicit in the reports how they explain that sort of the divides on race confuse them. They don't understand. A lot of them, they don't understand French very well. So they're kind of, so it's interesting that despite the geographical proximity to Haiti, there's a quite vast gulf in understanding, kind of similar to the one that Cuba has with the United States. And then in terms of the English-speaking Caribbean, it's a good question that I honestly don't know exactly how did at all, like how, if at all, his presidency or him as a character was perceived from, say, Jamaica, for example, as the closest island to Cuba. I would imagine that the administration of Belize would not be sympathetic towards him because of his support to the Guatemalan government, which ambitioned to annex Belize. So I imagine there would be some resistance towards him from British colonial authorities. But that's definitely something worth looking into, his broader image outside, I think, of the Spanish-speaking Caribbean.
Great, thank you.
A question from Steve, please.
Yes, a question I actually asked you before we started, really, but there seems to me, from my looking at Cuba of the period, from what was happening internally, particularly from the point of view of the workers' movement, and Carlos Prío comes over as a corrupt friend of gangsters. He had a gangster as his head of secret police. He was involved in the murder of Araceli Iglesias, Jesus Menendez. I mean, I could go on, but his brother Paco, who was a friend of Maya Lansky. How do you fit that kind of internal reputation that he had with the external reputation? Is there, how do you square the circle on that one?
I think, well, what I found very interesting to understand deeper this kind of sort of seeming contradiction between someone who talks a lot about sort of internationalism abroad, but then he's quite violent when it comes to dealing with the Cuban Communist Party. I think a lot of it stems from the early 1940s and the period when the Cuban Communist Party, the PSP, was in power with Batista. And I think if looking at relationship between the auténticos and the Communist Party from the 30s to the late 40s, I think helps us picture this better, because at the end of the day, both parties emerge from the same kind of milieu. They both emerged from the student movement, from someone like, I'm blanking on the name of the very famous founder, Mella, Julio Antonio Mella, for example, part of the, in fact, leading member of the student movement. And relationship between both parties is very complicated and is sort of punctuated by violence and mutual betrayal. So perhaps more famously, I think a lot of auténtico or people who become auténticos, they don't forgive the Communist Party for trying to appease Machado during the strike of 1933 and not joining the revolutionaries, for example. And then the Auténtico Party became very close to Trotskyist labor unions throughout the late 1930s and the early 1940s. So, for example, Sandalio Junco becomes the leader of the Auténticos trade section, so trade union section. And Sandalio Junco in 1942 is assassinated by members of the Cuban Communist Party, who at the time, because they enjoy the protection of Batista's government, are not persecuted. So I think it's in that context of sort of back and forth, violent wrestling over the power of the trade unions that I can make sense of how Prío fits in. And I'm curious to learn more about the connections between the Auténtico trade union movement and the small sort of Trotskyist unions in Havana in the late 1940s, because they seem to share their animosity towards the Stalinist Partido Socialista Popular. So I think it's in that kind of long context that I situate this hostility between Castro and the Cuban Communist Party.
Thank you. Sounds like you two can have a fruitful discussion offline, and given the overlaps in your work. There's a question from Nisha, please.
Yeah, hi. So I guess it's more to add to the discussion than a question, but there is also a bit of a question in there. So I was living in Cuba last year for 7-8 months as part of like a year abroad from uni, and I remember in the run up to the Primero de Mayo, the 1st of May parade, we had an immigration officer turn up at our door, and he came up with like a list of questions. Obviously, we're Westerners, and one of the questions was, what's your opinion on Prío? And my friends and I looked at one another, because in all due respect, we're not really taught about that in my part of the degree that I'm doing. I mean, I'm in my final year now, and we just looked at each other and we're like, Prío? Who's Prío? And then we just were like, oh, we don't, in Spanish, obviously, we're not quite sure of who he is. And, off the bat of the last question, Steve Cushion's question, it was like, was it because he's seen as a gangster, or was it because he's not seen as a good person in Cuba? But I just thought that was something quite interesting to add, because it was out of all the questions he had, that was one that we were like, oh, is there a right or wrong answer? So we just decided to stay quiet, is what I'm trying to say. But yeah, I just thought that was something interesting to add.
No, definitely. I'm so happy you shared this, because I had no idea, and I would have never imagined that his name would come up as this kind of question to, I guess, understand where you fall within, as if this was some kind of live issue in 2024. So that's fascinating, because I would also imagine when I was in Cuba, I mean, I didn't see any kind of anything that kind of relates to not just Prío, but the kind of the Auténtico period. I mean, there's not a lot. Of course, people know who he is, sort of. I think that, in school he's kind of mentioned, but I think it's fascinating the fact that there's a question about him in that kind of context. No, I think
I didn't hear his name anywhere else in Cuba. And then I Googled, I was like, who is he talking about? And then obviously, that's when I saw this talk and I was like, oh my gosh, so interesting. But yeah, I just thought I'd add that.
I mean, that's part of the reason why I became so interested, because I thought, who is this guy and why is he so relatively unknown? And so that was initially part of my interest in the topic, which is who exactly is this person?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat from Alpha Kane, who asks, what did Prío do with regards to illiteracy, and whether Batista did anything at all to combat illiteracy after taking power?
That's a good question, because the sort of the question of, or the issue of illiteracy sort of dominates Cuban politics from the 1930s. And in some way, its legacy continues to be quite live today. So it's in the 1930s, Batista was first indirectly in power between 34 and 40. And he sort of established a big kind of public works program to build schools and try to mitigate illiteracy. It was quite riddled by corruption. And then during the Auténtico governments, the corruption continued, and if not, was taken to another level under the government of Grau San Martin, which is from 40 to 44, partly because of a very well-intentioned policy that completely backfired in policy, which was in practice, which was that the Cuban government decided that a percentage of income from selling sugar would be directly taken to the education ministry. And the idea being that as much, sugar, all the sugar that Cuba sells, 1% would go to education. In reality, what this translated into is that the Minister of Education in the early 1940s was notoriously corrupt and became a billionaire. And he used a lot of his money to sort of orchestrate his own political campaign, which failed. Anyway, lots of mismanagement, corruption. And under Prío, he replaced that man died. And he was replaced by a man called Aureliano Sánchez Arango, who tried to enforce a kind of more responsible management of education. I'm not sure to which results exactly. I mean, probably nothing earth-shattering. And then under Batista's second dictatorship in the 50s, I'm not sure how much attention illiteracy received beyond kind of photo shoots where he would open a school and sort of take lots of pictures.
Thank you. I had another question. You mentioned that in Prio's sort of election campaign, he made much of being a friend of Dominican and Spanish anti-dictatorial movements. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about his relation to the Spanish question, and the fact that he put those into his election platform makes it suggests that was something that he thought would resonate with people. So what was kind of the status of the kind of Cuban facing towards the dictatorship in Spain, and those kind of transnational or exile connections that there might have been from Spain and Cuba at the time?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because at the time, of course, I think around 1 million Spanish people migrated to Cuba in the early 1910s. So, for example, if you look at the leadership of the Cuban Revolution, I don't know how many of them are children of Spanish migrants. So Spanish politics were, and the sort of the Spanish question, especially from the proclamation of the Republic all the way to the mid-1950s, they're quite alive in Cuban politics. And there is a particularly sort of a particular flashpoint in the late 1940s, because after the Second World War, there's a lot of hope among sort of Latin American progressives that with the victory of the Allies, this means that Franco is also going to be overthrown. And for example, I was checking Bohemia, the Cuban magazine, for the number when the Second World War ends, and they have a very big kind of caricature of sort of Hitler and Mussolini dead, and then there's a sign that says "Y este cuando," and it's a picture of Franco. So they really see it as a succession of now, now it's. Then again, because of Cuba having a very big Spanish colony, there are also a lot of Francoist sympathizers in Cuba, and they have a very strong presence, particularly in commerce. So the issue kind of blends into Cuban politics, where part of being a revolutionary means being with the Spanish Republic, and being with sort of the Machado and the kind of dictatorial past is supporting Franco. So in that sense, the Spanish question is kind of enmeshed with Cuban politics, and it's becomes part of the debate, and it's also a time where the Spanish Republican government is moving from Paris to Mexico City. So some socialist leaders travel to Cuba when Grau is president to do some kind of publicity tour, and there's a lot of support from the kind of the grassroots Auténtico party base to support the Spanish Republic. So that's a very interesting kind of question of how Spanish politics became kind of transposed into Cuban politics, and something worth looking more into.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any more questions from anyone in the chat or wants to raise their hand? Yes, Jean, thank you.
Let me come in. Yeah, thank you, Nicolás. I too, like Kate, learned lots about Prío, and it's such a contradictory period in Cuban politics. I mean, when isn't it? But one of the questions, my question really follows on from Steve's interjection and his research, because my own work on the tobacco workers, where the Communist Party was very strong and the communist trade unions were, Prío was the baddie. He was the gangster and he was the baddie in the picture. But your work has been on, democracy and the Cold War, and so it's beyond Cuba. I mean, Prío fits into this, but then the Cold War was so much in Latin America to do with dismantling organized labor, and especially communist-led labor, but not exclusively so. I mean, when you look at that history across Latin America. So how does this vision, I mean, in that context, Prío is serving the interests of the US, despite the rhetoric, despite everything else. So it becomes very complicated, how that anti-communism gets imbued into all the other kind of political shenanigans, if you want, that are going on. And it's fascinating about Juan Bosch, because it's sort of like a contradiction almost. Anyway, I throw that out because it's that bigger picture that I was very intrigued by. Mm-hmm. And in terms of, the vision of Prío, I mean, all the years that I was researching and in Cuba, granted quite a while ago now, Prío was a baddie, and it was corrupt, a corrupt form of democracy. And he very quickly, of course, became a spokesperson in the exile. And so that compounded that vision. So you've got, in terms of the Cubans, I'm sure you've got quite an uphill battle with what you're doing. But I was thinking of Marifeli as well, Marifeli Pérez Estable and her work, and how she was trying to grapple with the image of Grau and Prío, and the pre-Batista and pre-Batista years.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess something that I don't intend to change Prio's image from baddie to goodie, because part of my interest in Prio is just to eliminate this kind of idea of baddies and goodies. No, I think that's part of the interesting thing about the period, because yeah, he's very much kind of the bad guy, and I'm not interested sort of in that kind of conversation over whether he's corrupt and then he was bad and then democracy doesn't really count because it's corrupt. I mean, it's not like any kind of regime doesn't have corruption. So that if that's, I think it becomes a bit of a sterile conversation on those terms. But I think it's interesting to understand the period in terms of the Cold War. The way I sort of fundamentally look at it is that I think the Auténtico Party, like almost the majority of sort of political parties of that kind of space in the spectrum, which is kind of hard to define. Some people call it the democratic left just because they're not they're not communist parties. But I think their idea with regards to trade unions, I don't think their intention is to dismantle trade unions completely. They just want them to be controlled by people they like. They just want to control it with their own government. So I think that they're wrestling with the Cuban Communist Party is for control over the trade unions, whereas I think the aim of the United States is to do without the trade unions in the first place. No, I think so. In that sense, it's interesting. For example, something that I picked up from Steve's book on A Hidden History of the Cuban Revolution is to what extent, as the 1952 elections come closer, Prío gives more and more concessions to the trade unions that are controlled by his party. And in this kind of sequence of concessions of power to the trade unions, conservative Cubans and Cuban businesses and the US ambassador and the British ambassador become very alarmed. And if you look at the newspapers of the time, like Diario de la Marina is the main example, the rhetoric becomes quite paranoid that Prío is leading Cuba into a communist dictatorship, which is very ironic given everything else that happens. But there's this fear that in giving concessions, opportunistic concessions, because there's an election coming up, to trade unions, which are not communist, his party controls, but they're becoming so powerful that how much can he control them actually? That all of these concessions become sort of a ghost that the Cuban conservatives can wave as impending signs of a Marxist takeover. So in that sense, you understand why the US was so supportive of the Batista coup, because they thought, even though Prío was clearly not a communist sympathizer, in the words of one US official, he's not as reliable against the communists as Batista is, because Batista is foolproof, he's completely reliable, and Prío, we don't know what he is exactly. So I think that complicates.
Doesn't bear that out, of course. Well, the history doesn't bear that out. I mean, either with Batista during the 50s or Batista during the 30s. But that bigger picture of the Cold War, I mean, what you're, perhaps I didn't express it clearly enough. I mean, it was about smashing any communist or certainly communist, but other leadership of trade unions that the US didn't like and that their friendly governments didn't like. And Prío fits into that because what he did was smash a certain kind of union, but bolstered a different one. And certainly in those sectors where the other, it was the other union that was strong. I can't speak for all the other sectors, but certainly in the sector that I was looking at, or I mean, you could look at the dock workers as well. So it's very, that whole kind of period is, well, I mean, you're discovering how complex it is when you start digging.
Yeah, no, I think that's why I find it fascinating. I think, yeah, it's interesting to see how how the relationship with the US government then becomes also fraught because a main plank of Prio's program is to industrialize Cuba, and for that he needs loans from the US, and the US rejects, they refuse to give him loans because they refuse the idea that Cuba industrializes, because they should be specializing in sugar, which is what they want them to do. And there's a lot of destabilizing kind of moments where, for example, the US government reduces Cuba's sugar quota in an electoral year. So there are these moments where the US government sabotages Prio's administration. So they deny him credit, and then they reduce the sugar quota right in an election year. So I think that also adds more complication to the idea that Prio is just following orders from the United States, because the United States are not exactly sympathetic towards him either. But yeah, it's. I think I should spend much more time on this period than I am at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we will give you a rest now, but I think your paper was excellent, and it's just such a good example of how, when we kind of lift our eyes out of the national framework and try and do these regional and transnational histories, which are so difficult to do, source-wise, and all the other reasons why they're harder to do, but so fruitful and making us look with fresh eyes at both of those stories. So thank you for that, and thank you for the great contributions from the floor. Before we say goodbye, I just want to say that our next seminar in the Caribbean Seminar Series is going to be on the 13th of March, and that will be by Ozzy Warwick, who is a very significant trade union leader in Trinidad and Tobago, and he's going to be speaking about contemporary labor struggles in the Caribbean. So I think they're kind of relevant to some of the stuff that we've spoken about just now. So please join us on the 13th, and by then we will have eliminated all technical disasters. And thank you for everyone for sticking with us for despite the 10-minute late start, especially Nicolás. I'm so glad we didn't have to reschedule you. So thanks everyone. Un applauso grande.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yes, that's great. Thank you.